So today we're going to talk about external analysis. We'll focus on two factors. But before that, let's quickly recap what we have learned from the last lecture. So in the last lecture, we talked about industry analysis. We first define what an industry is, and which is a group of companies that produce competing product or service. And from our initial exercise, we learned that how one define industry can be complicated. Sometimes it may not be that straightforward. As a result, top management team often will rely on their subjective perceptions on who they will consider as a major industry competitors. And furthermore, in next lecture, we'll also have talked about industry life cycles and the corresponding dominant strategy that firms often adopt in order to survive and prosper. We conclude that with Michael Porter's five-force model. One important thing you want to pay attention to is that Michael Porter's five-force model or the industry life cycle analysis only explain how the overall environments may influence firm performance in that particular industry collectively. It doesn't really provide any explanation on how individual firms, their performance may differ, right? So that's one of the important key takeaway from industry level analysis. And furthermore, Michael Porter's model has its limitation, right? So oftentimes, although it's one of the first dominant frameworks that people have come up with to understand industry influence on firm performance, yet this type of analysis only capture a snapshot of what's going on. So that simply means that it's not dynamics. The performance impact it captured simply will be fairly static, depending on the particular point in time you conduct such analysis. All right. So oftentimes the type of analysis may not provide dynamic insights. So that's another important issues. Now let's move on and talk about external environment. Today we'll focus on political, legal, and economic forces, and we'll talk about how each of these forces influence firm operating in such external environment. So let's get started. So the agenda is fairly straightforward. We will first cover the overview of the macro environment. Then we'll talk about each of the political legal force and then the corresponding impacts. Overall, macro environment simply refer to potential influence that will shape industry and individual firms operating within such macro environment. So the macro environmental force really influence firm level or industry level performance, not individual firm level performance, right? So that's an important distinction. And furthermore, certain force may be more prominent in some industry, but not in others, right? So that's important idea. Simply highlight that although macro environmental force is important, it does not influence all industry consistently. Well, this will become clear when we go into greater detail on these macro environmental forces. Today, we're going to talk about two macro environmental forces, political legal force, basically highlight the impact of political and legal actions that government, whether it's regional or federal level of government policies, may have influence on firm profitability within particular industry. Then we'll quickly touch base on what economic forces are and how they will influence industry level firm performance. And for the next lecture, we will talk about social force and technology force and their impact on industry level profitability. In terms of political legal force, there are a number of uh, forces that can significantly influence firm profitability within or even across different industries. Those are the elections, legislation, core decisions, and government agency activities. And we'll talk about each component, each force in greater detail. So um, you will have a group discussion on how presidential election in the United States in the past have influenced how firms are managed, right? Through this discussion, you will be able to gain a better insight on how these political force have shaped firms' profitability within a particular industry, right? So be sure to work on that group discussion. Some of the, and oftentimes after the discussion, you will learn that different election outcomes could signal different type of political preference. A good example would be with the Biden's elect to the office. We have seen the several prior policy have got revert back because we know that when Trump was the president, that he has made certain policy change that's completely different from those made by Obama. And when Biden took over, we can easily see how such preference or such policy have been reversed back to the previous version. So these changing policies could significantly influence how firms operate. Another good example would be legislation. And here, there's several important legislation that have significantly influenced how firms operate and also firms' profitabilities. A good example would be Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which overhaul the U.S. tax code, including a reduction of corporate tax rate and at the same time also eliminate the individual mandate in the 2010 Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. A more recent example would be the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act, which provide funding for broader access, clean water, electric grid renewal, and transportation and road proposals. All these change in legislation also come with a significant amount of resource that help industry operating in that particular space to get more resource and which will help them prosper in the long run, right? So all these legislation represent an important political influence on how firms may profit from such legislation or policy change. Another important factor would be government regulations. So regulation often can be costly to firms because in order to follow these regulations, not only they will need to hire lawyers in order to understand what this policy means and how this policy will influence their day-to-day operation. It also would be fairly costly to implement such change. You can imagine the number of new positions that we need to create in order to facilitate such change, adoption, and implementation of these policies. That's why often large firms will hire lobbyists, or they may even have in-house lobby group that will try to influence regulators to create conditions that will be favorable to their company. And oftentimes it will be somehow creating entry barriers to prevent new ventured from entering into that particular industry space, right? So here's examples illustrating how President Obama finalized historic 54.5 miles per gallon fuel efficiency standards by 2025. With this policy in place, it really provides very strong incentives for automakers to really improve their fuel efficiencies or the adoption of electric cars, right? And although this would be helpful for the environment, for the car manufacturing company, at least in the short run, they actually increase the production price. As some estimate, it will increase up to 3,000 per vehicle in order to meet such requirement. So this is a great example to see how government regulations can significantly influence how firms operate. And Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is another one, which illustrates the increasing regulation in healthcare provider and insurance companies in order to lower costs and expand coverages. So there are still going debate on the short-term and long-term impacts, because on the one hand, people believe in for individuals who believe in free market type of economy, they will argue that such protection act actually will reduce competitiveness of these firms. As a result, it actually will hurt the underlying consumers who will be influenced by such policy. On the other hand, some others will have argued that if the government do not uh, increase such regulation to ensure to lower costs and to expand coverages, then the few dominant firms operating in this space actually will have advantages. They will gain profit by taking advantage of small guys like you and me, right? So they are both sides of the arguments, and they are still widely debated. So in addition, the other political or legal forces would be a good example would be for food consumption. The productions, processing, and consumption of food has often been heavily regulated in the US. And one good example would be sugar and fat contents and genetic modified goods. Oftentimes, because people are more health consciousness, so we see an increase in regulation in the intake of these contents, and that policy change and also result in the adoption of newer healthy practices. Right? So these are some of the examples on how political legal force could significantly influence and shape firm performance. And globally, we can see that there's a rise of regulation and protectionism after World War I. Although it gradually shifted toward free trade in the late 1980s through the 2000s, in more recent years, we have witnessed that protectionism start to rise again. And especially the U.S.-China trade dispute in recent years. That also suggests that these will significantly influence international companies who may manufacture their goods products in one country, while the cost of production will have significantly increased because such trade uh, this dispute. So although at first we thought this may be a short-term phenomenon when Trump was elected, but since like the such China-US trade dispute had been continued and will be continued for a while. And how things will unfold, it will be interesting to see as well. There in the US, there are also greater trend toward more regulations since the late 2000s. And this is because at that time, especially if you remember, during the around 2008, we have a major financial crisis, and banks and some financial institution were not being very careful in terms of how they package their investment vehicles and create a highly risky asset that could easily damage the overall ecosystem. So that could result in the financial crisis. As a result, to combat and to account or attenuate such crisis that will happen in the near futures, the election of President Obama have created a shift back toward greater regulations in the financial industry to prevent potential financial crisis from rise again. But when President Trump was elected, he tended to focus more on reducing regulations. And however, that's still which one would be the best approach is still remain to be highly debated. And US still remain divided on these issues. So it would be interesting to see how in the next 10 years, how US may respond to such division. And you may have this group discussion, but it depends on how much work you have already exist. I may drop this group discussion, but if you have the time, feel free to think about some examples on how economic force could have affect a given industry. Be sure to explain and think about how each factor will identify and will influence that industry, not just provide a general argument, right? So by doing this thought exercise, you will develop a better understanding on what economic force could significantly influence industry level profitabilities. And overall, there are four important economic forces that can significantly shape industry level firm profitabilities. They are economic condition of the country, right? Whether we're going through recession or not. Inflation rate play also an important role. Interest rate, as we have witnessed in recent years, also play a significant role. They will shape firm profitabilities. And finally, exchange rate could influence international trades, in an international business. So let's discuss these in greater detail. In terms of key economic considerations, and overall, if the US dollar decline in values, US export become less expensive simply because it's more the price of US goods become more competitive, right? On the other hand, US import goods will become more expensive, at least in the short run. That's one example illustrating how the value of US dollars can significantly influence firms doing international trades. So that's why they pay close attention to monetary exchange rate. Also, in economic condition of a country would be very important to pay attention to because it will influence the overall industry profitability. And in fact, a good economy may not be good for all industry. When economy is doing well, pawn shop and discount store often will suffer, but those stores, on the other hand, will thrive, will prosper when the economy is during recession. And so these are some of the, so we just discussed a few key highlights on how economic force may influence the overall industry level profitabilities. Of course, there are ecological influence that you should be pay attention as well. This simply refers to the environment of living things that are part of the economic environment because these ecological influence could significantly alter the cost structure of the entire industry. Think of global warming or all those natural disasters that have occurred more frequently compared to perhaps 10 years ago, right? So oftentimes these natural disasters, many will argue, is due to global warming or as a result what's happening is that all these extreme conditions occur have occurred more frequently and making it very difficult to predict how these extreme weather could affect economic activity, right? Because we all know that predicting weather is one of the most difficult problems that many scientists have tried to solve, but it's not that easy. So as a result, these ecological force often intertwine with political legal force. And because government, whether it's US, UK, Europe, Asia, China, Japan, Korea, they all try to manage these economic development in order to attenuate ecological issues. And that's why in the recent years, we've seen the rise of renewable energies and clean energy as a way to preempt potential issue related to global warming, etc. Right? So this ecological influence would be also important consideration. And as a result, there's a strong promotion for ESG practice that to ensure that things or business practice will be more sustainable in the long run. Many firms have started to create carbon capture techniques in order to help reduce uh, carbon dioxide and which should alleviate some of the global warming issues. However, there are both sides of the story when it comes to climate change, right? And people who advocate that climate change exists often highlight the notion that human activity have substantial influence on global weather pattern. Proponents of this view believe that and argue that carbon dioxide ultimately is the major factor because first often doesn't matter what industry you are at, there you will leave certain carbon footprint as a result because collectively all these firms will emit a significant amount of carbon dioxide. As a result, all these firms should be responsible to reduce such carbon footprints. Otherwise, we are simply exchange economic profitability with environmental issues. On the other hand, critics of climate change will often argue that, well, there's no real relationship between carbon dioxide and global temperature. The typical counter argument will be that the Earth climate has been warming and cooling uh, from time to time for many, many years. And Also, they may also highlight that scientific protection for global cooling in the 1970s have been incorrect. So they will use this line of argument and highlight that maybe global warming is not real, right? The truth is, doesn't matter whether you are for it or whether you are against it. It's important to take the ecological issues into considerations, because in the long run, it would be better to be over prepared than under prepared. So you want to think about this, and oftentimes consumer will expect firm will take responsible action to protect the environment. That's why ESG practice is has been quite popular, and there are also various certification agencies to certify that firms have really take the impact of their operations seriously. And when you have a chance, take a look at these videos. So this video was recorded in 2022 and talk about 2022 recession. It provided a very interesting glimpse on how recessions in 2022, as predicted, can be very complicated, right? And when recession occur, there will be significantly impact on all industry, but such impact may vary industry by industry and across different business model. As we have discussed briefly earlier, such impact may actually be beneficial for firms that provide values for end users in this recession during recessions. A good example would be Groupon. Actually, if you have used their service, basically what they do is they will offer a discounted price when large number of individuals have for large number of individuals for certain deals. Their business model was quite successful after the 2008 financial crisis. During the recessions, many consumers were looking for good bargains, right? So their business model actually provided opportunities to grow their business quite significantly. And that really conclude our sections on political and and economic environmental factor, and how these factors will influence firm performance within a particular industry. The remaining of this slides simply give you some exercise ideas for analyzing general environment. Let me quickly go over what these are. So this can be would be quite relevant for your final project. And in this analysis, it highlight how you can analyze political, legal, and economic forces. Basically, what you need to do is you need to identify the important force that could impact the industry for the company you choose to study. Right? You want to specify precisely how these factors will influence industry. And remember, the key takeaway from this type of analysis is you want to look at industry level impact. You do not want to mix how firm will respond to these external forces in this analysis yet, because it doesn't, it's not the scope of such external analysis. There are some useful websites such as forester.com and economic.com. These websites will help provide additional information about external environmental factors that could help you to better identify and understand how they will impact your industry. So be sure to use these websites. All right. And with that, that concludes today's lecture. Thanks so much.